Aliens, pinball, and balls of steel are just a few of the things to be found in Duke Nukem Forever. But is the game forever tainted by its poor reception, or has it aged a little better? Welcome, my name's AZDash and welcome to another retrospective video. 1991 saw the release of the first Duke Nukem game, a side-scrolling shooter with some platforming, headlined by a tank-top-wearing, shotgun-wielding hero known as Duke Nukem. The game was a critical success for developer Apogee Software, and a follow-up was quickly commissioned and released in 1993, known simply as Duke Nukem 2. The second game improved upon the original in virtually every way, with significantly more detailed graphics, multiple weapons, and smoother animation, all while following the tried and tested formula that made the original great. With the gaming world quickly moving towards 3D graphics, in 1996 Apogee underwent a rebranding to 3D Realms and released the third installment in the series, Duke Nukem 3D. The third installment delivered a far more interactive experience, not just in the 3D environments and excellent audio, but with far more personality for Duke, including some limited voice acting by the legendary John St. John. The third entry was another critical success for the developers and went on to sell millions of copies across virtually every platform, with many re-releases over the years adding additional content, as well as a very substantial community which is still active today. With yet another hit under their belts, it didn't take long for the team to announce another game, with Duke Nukem Forever being announced in April 1997. Now, it's no great secret that what followed was one of the longest and most turbulent development histories of any game, including multiple scope, engine, and personnel changes, culminating in 3D Realms effectively abandoning it completely and Gearbox acquiring the IP. Then, in 2011, some 14 years after its initial announcement, Duke Nukem Forever finally released for the PC, PlayStation 3, and Xbox 360. The version we are playing today is the PC Steam version, which was purchased for this video, and while the store listing does not list modern hardware as supported, I had assumed that given it was being sold on Steam, it would work without any major issues. In reflection, this assumption was perhaps not the most wise one to make, as there are several high severity, yet thankfully fixable issues. The first issue I encountered was after playing through the first 5 minutes of the game, I felt like the graphics looked worse than I remember. Now, time can play tricks on our mind, and after I played around with some of the resolution settings, I resigned myself to the fact that I just remembered it wrong, until I started noticing that textures looked higher resolution the further away I was from them. After going through the settings some more and turning off post-special effects, the game's fidelity improved dramatically. Another issue I encountered was during a driving segment where you need to use Duke's monster truck to jump a gap. I attempted this jump so many times, and every time I fell just short. After loading a previous save and backtracking a fair amount to see if I had missed something, I stopped to do a quick Google search and learnt that there was a known issue with VSync and certain physics not working as expected in the game. After a few quick tweaks in the menu, I was finally able to make the jump and continue on with the level. Now, I'm realistic in the fact that some older games have issues on modern hardware. Heck, some older games had issues on legacy hardware. However, it's frustrating that given both of these fixes are relatively simple, the developer has chosen not to invest the time to fix them, especially given the fact that it's not exactly being sold for a bargain bin price. In terms of the story, it's about as paper thin as you get. Aliens have invaded Earth, again, stolen the planet's women, again, and Duke needs to single-handedly save the day, again. Whereas Duke Nukem 3D told this story mainly through environmental design, Duke Nukem Forever tells the story with overt and regular exposition, punctuated with a level of humour that falls flat far more times than it works. There's no shortage in the game of sexual references, with everything from full frontal nudity to suggestive sequences. However, unlike titles which have included these items in the past to complement their story, what's here feels extremely forced and overused to the point that it often detracts from the experience as opposed to complements it.
I could carry you around in my pocket like a little pet. Your hot pocket. Oh, that's funny.
There's also the topic of swearing, and let me be clear, I don't have an issue with swearing in games, but what's here so often feels like it is so far overused that it just pulls you out of the experience. What is actually funny is that throughout the story the game pokes fun at several other games, yet many of these games are objectively far better games. Overall, the best I can say is that there is a story, it's just not one that hasn't been told before, like it's literally the same story as the last game. Before we continue, a massive thank you to those who support the channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. With that out of the way, let's have a drink, make some popcorn, and head back to 2011 to remember Duke Nukem Forever. If there's one accolade that I can give Duke Nukem Forever, it's that it delivers an immensely varied player experience. There are times when you are on foot, times when you are behind a turret, times when you are driving a vehicle, and even times when you are shrunk down in size. The issue is that in all of these player experiences, the actual gameplay experience varies wildly depending on the experience's interaction with other systems and mechanics. In terms of the basic, camera and control are mostly competent. However, Duke's movement speed is quite a bit slower than the previous installment, with you needing to engage a specific sprint function to move quicker. However, you cannot fire your weapon while sprinting, meaning it's often a trade-off between fighting and moving. Now, this mechanic isn't new to games and has been used with good effect in many earlier shooters. Call of Duty in 2003 used this to really good effect, offering a risk versus reward mechanic for moving between points of cover. The issue is that Call of Duty didn't feature enemies that can A, teleport, or B, leap 20 meters across the room to you. Now, there is a power-up that increases your movement speed, but this appears so infrequently that for the majority of the adventure, you will be stuck with Duke's slow pace. This is actually made worse by the decision to set the default FOV to just 75, and honestly, this decision baffles me. I lost track of the amount of times I took damage off screen simply because I didn't know there was an enemy there. It is particularly egregious with enemies that can fly, as they will sometimes be far out of your vision, as well as enemies that can leap towards you, as they will often leap off screen directly into you. Now, you can adjust the FOV on the PC version to 90, which broadly speaking was the industry standard at the time. However, it's baffling that this wasn't the default setting from a clean install. Another thing the default FOV impacts is the platforming sections of the game, and boy does Duke Nukem Forever feature a lot of platforming. To be fair, there is some platforming in the game which makes narrative sense, is relatively short, and feels satisfying to complete. However, there are some areas, particularly when you are shrunk down in size, that just drag on for far too long and firmly enter the realm of being a chore as opposed to fun. There's an electrified kitchen you come across about halfway through the game as Tiny Duke, with the objective being to save an employee by turning off the power. To do this, you need to navigate virtually the entire kitchen, engaging in a variety of timing and platforming puzzles to reach the objective. The issue is that this just goes on for far too long, and while I do have to give credit to some of the design choices, like sauce bottles exploding on Duke, it feels like this sequence was really pushing the limit of the game's control system. Oh, and there's a body laying in the electrified water that you need to jump on to progress, and yeah, at the very least this should cause damage to Duke, if not outright kill him, but I guess it's a slippery slope examining Tiny Duke conductivity. The other area that Control touches is the puzzles, and like with the platforming, there are some good ones here which are fairly logical and satisfying to solve, and then there are some poor ones, including what I believe is one of the worst passages of puzzle gameplay in a game, maybe ever. Early in the game, you find yourself in an alien structure that is almost pitch black. Thankfully, Duke has night vision, which enables him some limited vision. However, to open some of the locked doors in this section, you need to move these large balls around, which emit a type of UV light which blinds Duke's night vision, meaning you need to switch between pushing the balls in darkness and being blinded. I get that this might have sounded like a good idea, but blinding the player in the name of progression does not translate to a positive experience, and like with so many parts of Forever, I just don't understand how playtesters completed this and said, yep, this is all good, because it's definitely not. Apart from the time spent on foot, Duke also takes control of a variety of vehicles throughout the game, with a fair chunk of the game's middle chapters featuring Duke driving a monster truck. And look, these sections control well enough. Outside of the VSync bug, I don't think I ever had any issues with control of any of the vehicles. I do think this section in particular drags on a little too long for its own good, and seems to prioritize the spectacle of making jumps as opposed to actual meaningful progression. But to be fair, the vehicle segments were probably the most fun I had with the game, which is telling when the game is marketed as a first-person shooter. This brings us to the biggest issue I had with the game, and that's combat. Combat in Forever is a very unbalanced affair. At times you will have level design for a horror game, enemies for a bullet hell shooter, and weapons for something in between. The game uses a trope of only being able to carry 2 weapons at any one time, and like with the sprint function, many other games have done this well. The original Halo is a great example of only being able to carry 2 weapons at any one time, dictating how you approach particular situations. However, in the case of Halo, the level and enemy design was meticulously created to ensure that virtually every weapon was always a viable choice. It was just up to how the player wanted to approach the situation. In the case of Forever, there are far too many times when the player is forced into situations where they may or may not have the right weapon to approach combat effectively. Or if there is a particular weapon that's required, it's just conveniently placed in the area, negating the whole idea of player choice. This is all made a lot worse by the actual weapons themselves, which too often feel underpowered and inaccurate, with the few weapons that are powerful being gated by limited ammo and particular set pieces. Even the shotgun, which the game hypes up before presenting, takes an eternity to reload, meaning that intense combat encounters, a lot of the time you spend running around trying to reload, as opposed to actually engaging in the gunplay. And look, I don't have a problem with realistic reload sequences in games, but the speed in which some of these weapons are reloaded seem more focused on inflating difficulty as opposed to representing realism. There is a regenerative health system in the game, which for the most part works well enough. The health gauge is known as the ego meter and can be extended by engaging in acts to boost your ego throughout the game. This is perhaps one of the game's genuinely fresh ideas, which combined with the level of interaction available in the environment, translates into a fairly good experience. There's also a lot of things Duke can do in the world, which while not contributing to ego, still provide some interaction. Drinking water from a fountain is a good example, and goes to show that quite a lot of attention was spent on making the world feel interactive. There are some turret-based combat sequences, and these are all fairly good experiences, with the game providing a rare glimpse of the player actually feeling powerful. Likewise, there are also quite a lot of bosses and mini-bosses spread throughout the game, and while it's clear that a fair bit of work has been put into the boss design, there's no real deep system or mechanic to defeat them, apart from shooting them until their health bar depletes, robbing the player of any real satisfaction upon completion. I think that one of the biggest challenges that Forever suffers from is the sheer volume of carryover mechanics from other games without any real thought as to how they might or might not work together. To be fair, there are some good passages of gameplay within the game, but for the most part, it's a turbulent experience which requires a good deal of patience to make it through to some of the more positive moments. Presentation-wise, Forever has not aged well. Graphically, the game is uninspiring, with the overall fidelity matching something from the early 2000s as opposed to 2011. However, it's not the fidelity that's the issue, it's the inconsistency. Some areas look really good, particularly in the first few chapters, whereas other areas just seem to have far less detail put into the textures and overall environments. There's a good example of this fairly early on in the adventure, where specific parts of a specific building can take damage to its structure. However, despite the player facing similar situations again, this mechanic is virtually never used again, and just makes its use in this one particular segment feel very unusual. Perhaps my biggest issue with the presentation though is the use of effects and screen shake. Even just firing your shotgun provides fairly substantial screen shake, which when combined with the red blood effect from taking damage, just delivers a far over the top HUD effect, which ends up compounding the already difficult gunplay. Sound design is a positive overall experience. While I don't think the writing is good, the voice acting is very good. Music and effects are also good and probably the closest in resemblance of all of the aspects of the game to the original 3D title, which itself was very good. Every now and again I'll have an opinion on a game which is different from the critics. Aliens Colonial Marines is a good example. I definitely don't think it's a great game, but I do think it's fun enough to warrant a pick-up on sale. In the case of Duke Nukem Forever though, I have to agree with the critics. I've tried really hard in this review to highlight things that I think the game does well, as there are some things such as the environments and voice acting. But the reality is that with few exceptions, I never really had fun playing it. In terms of what would need to be changed for me to have fun, honestly there's so many things that once you did change them, you would arguably not be playing the same game anymore. In saying that, I think having better weapons and more balanced enemies would have at least uplifted the moment-to-moment gunplay enough to squeeze some fun out of the game. But even then, is it a game that I would want to go out and buy? I can't say. While releasing a game with a large generational gap can be challenging, I often think about the way in which id Software handled the release of Doom 3. Both developers essentially faced the same problem, having a very popular franchise and needing to make the transition to a more modern gameplay experience. If you strip back all of the technical elements from Doom 3, which to be fair were very impressive for the time, Doom 3 delivers a very focused experience with excellent combat at the centre of everything it does. Sure, the world isn't as interactive, it doesn't have any of the vehicle sections or the player being shrunk in size, but it doesn't need any of this because the excellent combat provides a hook for the player to continue the game to completion. Duke Nukem Forever, on the other hand, Feels like the developers wanted to showcase everything they could do, which, as I said, is sometimes impressive, but rarely cohesive with the overall experience. I would have gladly had all of the vehicle segments removed in exchange for a more robust combat system, and this is really where I think the developers should have put their focus. It kinda goes without saying that both games have had vastly different reception, with Duke's outing being his last, while there have been several more entries in the Doom series. While we can't totally rule out another Duke game one day, at this point it does seem fairly unlikely. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.